Hey everybody, this week we'll be discussing the classic Action Comics 775, aka What's So Funny About Truth, Justice, and the American Way. We'll also be discussing its 2012 animated adaptation, Superman vs. the Elite, as well as its comic book sequel, Ending Battle. Guest Chris Clow will be joining me in just a moment to discuss all of that, but I wanted to give you a heads up. Make sure that you listen all the way through this episode, because after my conversation with Chris, we'll have a special epilogue segment in which I'll be joined by Superhero Cinephiles host Perry Constantine, and we will discuss your comments and reactions to Action 775. Enjoy! In late 1999, writers Jeff Loeb and Joe Kelly took on Superman. Over the next 2 years, they would upgrade his city, test his heart, warp his reality, elect his greatest enemy, and bring intergalactic war to his doorstep. It's the final chapter in the Triangle era, one of my most cherished runs, and the subject of a 7-part Digging for Kryptonite epic. It's the Loeb-Kelly era. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss what's so funny about truth, justice, and the American way from Action Comics 775 is one of the hosts of the Comic Binge, returning guest, Chris Clow. Welcome back.
Hey, thank you so much for having me back, Anthony. I really appreciate it.
Oh, I'm so happy to have you here, and I have to ask, how does it feel to have your flaws exploited, to be deconstructed?
Not great. It doesn't feel great, but hopefully there's something on the other end of that waiting to give whomever is causing this some well-deserved comeuppance. So we'll talk about it.
Yes. So, of course, like I said, we're referring to Action Comics 775. Written by Joe Kelly, penciled primarily by Doug Mahnke with some pages by Lee Bermejo. This was published in January 2001. And just to put it in the context of the Loeb-Kelly era that we've been discussing, this comes after Lex has been elected, but right before Return to Krypton and before Our World's at War. So let me ask you this. What was your initial reaction to the story when it first came out, and how, if at all, has your relationship changed to it over the years?
It's a good question. Honestly, my initial reaction to it the first time, I came to this story pretty late, all things considered, as a Superman fan. Back in 2010, I had decided to try to basically erase a pretty big blind spot that I had in Superman's publication history with the beginning of Jeff Loeb's run on the main title. And I had just gone through pretty, earth-shattering personal loss. My dad had just died around this time, and I was working at the comic book store. And the thing that was really, I just knew that I needed some more Superman. And in something like that, we all go through to the things that bring us comfort and bring us a degree of ease. And for me, that's Superman. In a lot of cases. So I remember I went to the comic shop that I worked at after hours one day when nobody was there, just kind of on a whim to be like, I wonder what we have of the Jeff Loeb run. And we had all of it, pretty much. I think we had a couple of little pockets here and there, but I started primarily with the main title with the issues that Loeb had written. And then from there, in different instances, would branch off into the other titles as necessary. And that was when I inevitably encountered this issue for the first time. And I was aware of its reputation ahead of time, but hadn't really absorbed that reputation into a perspective of my own. And the first time I read it, honestly, the issue blew me away. It really did. I had never been and continue to not be a huge fan of characters like the Authority, for instance. So when one of my coworkers kind of explained to me the idea of the Elite serving as a representative for something like the Authority, and as someone who I think I've told you multiple times, you might be sick of hearing it by now, but a habitual Superman defender in the halls of our comic book store, seeing how that conflict was positioned, it was definitely intriguing for me. And given that Superman did not have a high degree of popularity among our readers, like our college age readers that made up most of our subscriber base, it didn't seem like a ton of people had read this story outside of the Superman faithful. So I went into it weirdly kind of cold and came out of it really loving this issue and what it wanted to say and the statement that it makes about the necessity for moderation and for making those moral judgments about like the necessary use of force in addition to the philosophical arguments that go into truth, justice, and the American way. In the years since, I still hold this issue in pretty high regard. If there's anything that I guess kind of gets in its way when I read it, it's just that it is kind of inconsistently illustrated. And not that that's like necessarily a huge knock or anything, but I do think that if they had managed to stick like maybe just with Doug Monkey on the pencils, it might have improved the flow a bit. And it is pretty dense, but it's also a done in one, so I can forgive density if it's a single issue story, because for what it is, it packs a lot of stuff in here into rough like just under 40 pages, I think. I think the issue certainly punches above its weight as a done in one. Joe Kelly is a guy that I am convinced very greatly understands the importance of a character like Superman, in addition to just being a good writer himself. There aren't a lot of writers in the mainstream level of comics that I think can write uh, definitive Deadpool and definitive Superman. That's a very it's a very small list in my estimation, and Kelly sits at the top of it. So I still enjoy this issue quite a lot.
Right on, man. No, I what you said resonates with me. And the central premise, I assume most people listening to this are probably familiar with either the issue or perhaps its animated adaptation, the 2012 film Superman versus the Elite, which we'll also be talking about. We'll also be discussing the 8-part storyline ending battle, which came about a year or so after this and featured another confrontation with Manchester Black. But as far as 775 itself, the central premise is that you have this new team, the Elite, led by Manchester Black, and as you were alluding to, essentially analogs for the Authority. And they appear on the scene and challenge Superman and his notions of heroism and justice, and essentially make the argument that those values are outdated in a modern world and that we need a more forceful, decisive, lethal approach to justice. And for myself, like the rest of the Loeb Kelly run, I was reading this as it was coming out in the early 2000s, and I always liked this issue, to be clear. I always enjoyed it. But if I'm being perfectly honest, I think certain times along the way, because you would see it pop up on all of the top 10 lists year after year, and I think for a time, there was probably a part of me that felt maybe it was a bit overrated, but I don't feel that way anymore. And I think with the passage of time and seeing how timely it remains, if anything, perhaps even more resonant now than ever before, I think that has really increased my appreciation for it. And so to see the character and his values tested within the pages of the story, but to then also have this sort of meta approach as well, where the story essentially tackles some of those criticisms that people, fans, creators make about the character of Superman. You were saying this, and I agree with it, and I've lived it too. Being in the comic shop, being at cons, wherever it might be online, we're in a little bit of a bubble here in our Digging for Kryptonite community. We all love Superman, but that's not always the case out there. And so I think this really kind of tackles those criticisms, both in story and in the real world, head on, and it holds up amazingly well. I mean, help me out here. Is there any single issue, standalone single issue in the modern era of comics, of Superman comics, that has been as impactful and held up to this extent? I mean, I was really thinking, I mean, there are tons of great stories, but as far as like a one and done standalone, is there anything else that you feel like holds a candle to this?
In Superman, no, I don't think so. I mean, honestly, the only other like even just extending the pool beyond Superman, the only other done in one that I can feel hits as effectively to the core of the character as this one was honestly also around 2001 or a little after the Punisher Marvel Knight series #6, Do Not Fall in New York City, which is one of my all-time favorite single issues alongside this one. Um, is just such an incredibly well contained single issue story that tells you everything that you could possibly need to know about that character. And I would say that this is the same for Superman, particularly in an era in which he is constantly running away from this label of being passe or morally simple. One of the things that I really do appreciate about this, because we see the other side of this all the time, where Superman is depicted, or I mean, just a superhero in general who might show up on like a cutaway joke on a show like Family Guy, for instance, like just some generic superhero. We have to save the day, and the thing that one of the many things that I love about this issue is that Kelly turns that on its head to instead paint a caricature of an overly dark and cynical approach to superhero storytelling, but also just good evil storytelling. There's a moment relatively late where it's Manchester Black. In fact, it's page 15. Masks are for hiding, capes are for play. Villains don't share their plans before they smoke you, except in campaign speeches or the pulpit or in front of the classroom. Reality is a mite bloodier than sitcoms or comics. The grays stretch out farther. And it's like, there are people who might just take that in and not think very critically about it, but it is a caricature depiction of characters like the Authority. And it's one of the things that I appreciate, because in this instance, it's Superman who has the more well-developed perspective on the world around him. And he has to explain to all of the elite, like, guys, I know what the criticisms are. I know how people see me. That doesn't mean I'm wrong. And you don't see that a lot in Superman stories that do try to directly challenge his worldview and his moral authority, his legitimate moral authority.
Yeah,
But Kelly does a good job of establishing why it's legitimate.
yeah, 100%. I love that moment because it demonstrates a realism and a self-awareness from Superman when he says, "I'm not an idiot. I know the way the world is. I know there are bad people in power." I mentioned the Authority. It's funny, before last night, I had never read any Authority except for like the Superman and the Authority miniseries, things like that. But I hadn't read any of the original stuff. And then I did read the first 4-issue arc of the original Authority series just for a little bit of context. But even in all these years prior, I mean, I certainly was aware of the Authority as it was coming out and its popularity. And so I've always been intrigued by this idea of the elite as a stand-in for that and all that it represents. It's really funny because we just did our President Luthor episode, and you haven't heard it yet based on when we're recording this. But I think my guest Bernie and I, we were a little bit split. I had more of an issue with this. He didn't. But my one gripe with the President Luthor development was that at that point in DC Comics continuity, the public of the DC universe had a pretty limited view of who Lex Luthor really was. And so while you feel Superman's frustration at Lex being elected to a point, I always hit a little bit of a wall with that because I felt, well, they don't have the full picture that you do. They're not really making a fully informed choice. But rereading this actually captured and tapped into exactly what I think I wanted from the President Luthor storyline, because I think here, and in fact, I'd say the animated movie does an even better job of this, of really showing the response of the public and how they are swayed by the elite and how this weighs on Superman and the effect when you get to that final confrontation, when they see Superman seemingly defeated and all of a sudden they start to wake up and realize, oh, we've made a mistake. We've gone down the wrong road. We've followed the wrong people. And then to see Superman come back and flip, and we'll talk more about it, but to see that ugliness that he seemingly demonstrates, and you see all of that register with them, the arc that the public of the DC universe goes on in this story was really great to me. And that was what I wanted more from the President Lex storyline, but I got it here, so it all worked out.
Yeah, and the adaptive philosophy for that movie was generally pretty solid. I only recently revisited it in preparation for this, but I watched it when it came out, of course. And for I remember being a little nervous about just like, okay, one issue of source material is gonna get what was it, like an hour and 50 a 75-minute movie
Yeah.
roughly there. But no, I think that Kelly, who also was the screenwriter on it, was really smart in expanding elements of the original story that didn't really have the real estate to fully explore in the issue itself. And the movie is not I don't feel like it stretches too far beyond the bounds of what we saw in the original issue. If anything, it just kind of smartly accentuated certain things and prolonged things that probably could have been prolonged in the original issue anyway. So I think the art style of the movie is a little strange to me,
For Superman
but
in particular, right? I did not care
yeah,
for the design of Superman. He looked caricature-ish. He looked as if you were watching a spoof on Family Guy or American Dad or something like that. I didn't have
right.
that issue with the rest of the character designs. It was really just Superman.
Yeah, there was something about like the proportionality of his face that kind of seemed to jump out at me when I watched it. But at the same time too, like they also just kind of made some interesting economical choices with the movie too. Like the Superman theme was the one reused from Superman Doomsday, which I thought
Yes.
was an interesting choice. Which is fine. Like, okay, that's fine. It's just the animated movies are so strange when you kind of isolate them, just because there's no like, especially for the ones that adapt different stories, there's no like singular motif that they stick with for different characters. But that's one of the things that I think is just so great about the story in general is that there is enough depth, enough narrative depth in the original issue for deeper dives that you can do in an adapted environment. And these necessary questions, like I don't think Superman is necessarily going to shake the perception of being morally passe anytime soon in the larger consciousness. But at the same time, I don't know how many people out in the quote unquote wild necessarily know about a story like this, despite its appearances in trades of the greatest Superman stories ever told, and all the weight that could come with something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, the structure of the story in both the original comic and the animated movie, I was really thinking about it. It was interesting. And I think the single issue, Action 775, even though it is an extra sized issue, it's a very efficient story and it accomplishes a lot in a relatively short amount of time. Yet, to your point, there is enough to unpack in a longer form like the animated movie. And I am a fan of the animated movie. I do love the fact that Joe Kelly had the opportunity to adapt it himself and write it. We saw that with Judd Winnick and Under the Red Hood and Darwin Cook with New Frontier, or he was at least a producer on it. So I do love when the creators of the source material are involved in the adaptation. And I would say, structurally at least, what really stood out to me in that adaptation, the movie, it's a much slower burn in terms of introducing the elite and then finding out exactly what the elite is all about and how starkly they contrast with Superman and his methods. Whereas the comic really plunges you right into it. And I think both approaches have value. But I guess hand in hand with that, what was interesting to me about the movie was that this question of whether or not Superman goes far enough is introduced before we even get to the elite. I mean, you see Manchester Black in that quick moment right before the credits, but early on, Superman stops the atomic skull, and that's when I clocked that theme from Superman Doomsday when they were fighting. I'm like, wait a minute, because we rewatched that not too long ago for our Death and Return adaptations episode. But then you have Superman called in before the UN for this debate about whether or not he should be killing adversaries like the atomic skull in battle. And there's this professor who's leading the discussion who ultimately is, I think, a fan of Superman, but he's playing devil's advocate and he's proposing these questions. And so it was just interesting to me that in the movie, this idea is at play in the world before you even get to a force like the elite that's really going to force the issue. But what was wild about the UN thing is like, I don't know. Maybe it's not that wild. These days, not much really surprises me anymore. But but back in 2012, I suppose, like just the notion that the leaders of the world would put this upon Superman, I really felt for him in this moment. It's like, hey, if you want to put any of these villains who are captured to death, you have a process for that. I mean, I feel like it's awfully unfair to put that upon Superman in the heat of the battle. But it was just interesting and kind of how that idea was introduced even earlier and by different parties in the movie. It wasn't just driven by the elite.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing that adds kind of a degree of ludicrousness, I guess, to the idea that he would be drummed before the UN and asked whether or not he should kill his enemies. It's like, well, in most depictions, Superman is not a deputized law enforcement official representing anybody. So if he did decide to kill his enemies on a regular basis, yeah, that's an extrajudicial killing that most places tend to frown upon. So, are you advocating that Superman extrajudiciously kill the people that he is trying to capture? But I mean, the I would prefer that these questions and these debates are part of the story. So if that's what it takes to introduce the concept, then that's fine. But for people who might be trying to pay attention to like realism or legal realism, and extrajudicial killing generally not a very good thing.
Yeah, exactly. So I would say, along with that, you also get more for Lois to do in the animated movie. She's investigating Manchester Black. They give you more of his backstory in terms of what he claims happened, and then you find out a little bit more beyond that. They introduce his sister who shares information with him. So again, it's just kind of drawn out a bit more, which may or may not be a benefit. I think it depends. I don't know, but I want to circle back to the comic itself, where we started with all of this, because here too, the structure of it was interesting. It kind of, in my view, you have, not in my view, it is what it is. You have three sort of actions by the elite, and then three conversations really between Superman and key figures in his life, sort of reconciling with what's happened. And so I really kind of liked that format or that flow of it, how it all then builds to that final confrontation. Because we start with this terrorist action in Libya. There's this giant genetically engineered ape that's attacking. And by the time Superman arrives there, the elite have already been there and left. They're not seen, but they destroy this creature along with all of the soldiers who were present as well. Whereas Superman could have potentially taken down this creature without any loss of life, but they just wiped out everybody. And though they didn't stick around after, they did deliver their message, it seems, to Jack Ryder at the Daily Star, because he seems to have the lowdown on them. And then very shortly after that, they deliver their manifesto. It's instantly downloaded into every PC on the planet, of course, except for the computers at the fortress, where we have the first of these conversations. And this one is between Superman and John Henry Iron Steel. I don't think we hit on this explicitly in our last episode, but right around this time in the Superman books and the pages of Man of Steel, Lois and Clark confided in John Henry that Clark is in fact Superman. And of course, John Henry had already figured this out because he's John Henry Irons. But it was a nice, long overdue moment, and I think a great sign of respect to really let him in. He more than earned it. And then you get this great moment between Superman and Steel in the fortress, and Superman has this like really contemplative moment where he's like, has the world moved on? And before John Henry can answer, then we lead into our next action by the elite, where there's this metahuman skirmish in Japan. And by the time Superman shows up, he gets knocked out by one of Cold Cast's blasts, right? Because in the elite, we're led by Manchester Black. We also have Cold Cast, Hat, and Menagerie. And so he's really disoriented in this battle, but he's there as the elite takes out this entire army of metahumans in Japan. And then when he comes to, he's on their ship, Bunny, this this living bacteria colony. But then this is when we have the first real conversation between them. I guess we had hit on this before, that moment from Superman about, hey, I'm not an idiot and all of that. But I don't know, anything about that exchange that you wanted to talk about that we didn't hit on yet?
Well, it's just like one of the things, and they kind of ran with this in the movie too, but the actual like surrender of autonomy of the ship, because they hint at the idea that it did have a mind at some point that Manchester got rid of. He said ostensibly for virtuous purposes, but Superman understandably isn't so sure about that. Um, I like this exchange because it does reinforce the kind of what we talked about before, just like the sort of caricaturish elements of the darker side of having a more realistic take that is essentially more, I think he argues it's actually more pragmatic in the long run to take the approach that they do. This is really the point where Superman's idealism is directly challenged by Manchester and the rest of the elite. Um, the detail that is embedded here, like this is one of the reasons I love Doug Mankey as much as I do. Like everything is so intricately placed in the pencils. And if you really want to, like if you took a magnifying glass to a Doug Mankey page, then you'll find a rather intense amount of detail. He's such an understated guy. I've met him a couple of times at conventions and it doesn't seem like that's necessarily like you wouldn't think of him as like a super detail oriented person just having a basic conversation at a convention with him. But my goodness, you can absolutely see it in his work. And these pages are a good example of that. But I mean the way that Manchester also uh he's just so cavalier in his descriptions of brutality too, that I think it's kind of designed to try to put Superman off guard a little bit because he's under the impression, and it's one of the things that I think is really well established by the writing, but also with the way that Mankey illustrates Manchester's expressiveness, is just he thinks he's talking to someone who is simple-minded. He thinks he's talking to someone who has the outlook on the world of a child. And there's this distinct lack of respect towards Superman, despite what the elite says about, we're fans, mate. Like they push that forward, but it doesn't seem like Black or anybody else on the elite really gives an abundance of thought to the fact that Superman is experienced by this point. And I feel like rereading this issue, that's the first time you get the glimpse of what is actually going to happen by the end of it. That maybe his philosophy is more well built, but also he's dealing with a bunch of rookies in comparison. And they're not going to stand a chance at the pivotal moment. So that's something that I think you can only really get on a reread of this issue, but I do think it's a conscious choice, if I were to guess.
Yeah. There's a point where Manchester offers to show him around and he's like, I don't want a tour. I want you to stop what you're doing. But I agree with you. I think that Manchester and the elite, their view of him is one of this out of step simpleton, right? Who is unwilling or incapable of doing what needs to be done in a modern world. And we hear talking heads on the news throughout the issue, and a lot of people seem to be sharing or buying into what the elite are selling. And that seems to be resonating. And they teleport Superman off the ship and they plop him at a used or a car dealership that's having a Superman themed sale. So it's just like slap in the face. And then we go to another one of these, I think, very poignant conversations. And it's a page. It's Clark and Pa on the front porch of the farm. And Pa's talking about how there's been a lot of talk, a lot of it bad in town. And he even had to put the slap on Ben Farnsworth, which I love. I would have loved to see that scene. That's great. But what Pa says, I think, kind of taps into a very core idea here that I want to unpack a little bit, where he says, essentially, right, he understands why people might feel this way, why this might resonate with them when you see what's going on in the world. And then, of course, Clark pushes back and he's like, well, so what is the answer? Just to do what the elite are saying, take the easy way out with this? And Pa's like, no, not necessarily, but you need to teach them. You need to show them the way. And this is one of my favorite parts of the issue, this moment, but kind of what it speaks to, where Pa's like, and if you can, at least, you can always kick their asses, essentially, right? Right, Clark? And Clark doesn't say anything. And he goes, right? So a couple of things here. Number one, I think one of the reasons why this is such an interesting issue is that, look, we have our view of Superman, what he's capable of, what he should and shouldn't do. And I think for all of us as fans, maybe the exact answer to that will vary somewhat. But the notion that there would be some frustration on the part of the people to see superpowered villains in and out of prison all the time, getting caught, getting back out, killing, causing destruction, and feeling like, well, there's this being who protects us, who has the ability to make sure this person can never hurt us again, and they're not willing to. So I mean, it's an interesting idea. And then obviously this kind of calls to mind this larger question about Superman and should he kill and under what circumstances should he kill? And well, I mean, that probably could be its own episode, but we've come at this a number of times over the years. We've looked at instances where Superman across media has killed or has almost killed or has seemingly killed. And the one that I think people still causes probably the most visceral reaction is the killing of Zod in Man of Steel. And we had a whole extensive conversation about it when we covered that movie again, not too long ago. Long story short, where I land on that is I think there was work in that movie in terms of the setup, the lead up to that, and the aftermath of that didn't happen, that really needed to really unpack that moment and what it meant for the character. That being said, looking at the act in and of itself, just in a vacuum, the killing of Zod in the heat of the moment to save the lives of those people in the subway station, from my point of view, kind of from a moral, ethical perspective and what I expect out of Superman, I'm okay with that. I know there are a lot of fans for whom that's crossing a line and Superman shouldn't kill under any circumstances. But for me, I can live with a moment like that. But a lot of times the way this comes up, and honestly, even the way it comes up here, and especially in the animated movie with the atomic skull scene, a lot of times it comes down to him executing, like full on executing villains after the fact. I mean, the end of the John Byrne run in the comics is a great example of that, where he executes Zod and the other Kryptonian criminals. And then, like I said, this moment here, particularly in the animated movie, and that's where I see no place for that. And we'll talk about the ending battle as well, where it's a similar sort of situation where it's not in the middle of action in the heat of the moment. It's an instance where the bad guy has been taken down and is ready to be apprehended. And there's this call, wherever it's coming from, but this call for Superman to coldly execute. And that's where I think there always kind of has to be that line. But I welcome any thoughts that you have on, I know it's a big topic, but wherever you want to go with it.
It is. Generally speaking, the thing that I find interesting about this story broadly is that the conversation with Jonathan really kind of speaks to multiple populist uprisings that we've seen in our own politics over the past 40, 50 years. And it's just as true now as it was when Joe Kelly wrote the words originally, whether you want to talk about the Tea Party movement or Occupy Wall Street or what we're seeing now. A lot of those moments are born out of this feeling of powerlessness that people have and a lack of faith, or at least a loss of faith in institutions to address their needs. And that is the root of a lot of these populist movements that come up. How that feeds into Superman's overarching need to try to preserve as much life as possible. I mean, I really feel like it gets back to that idea of legitimate authority, because he's somewhat an authority, no pun intended. But he's getting to what Paw says is really perceptive in the sense that it does require teaching, because as was demonstrated in the early parts of this issue, the elite certainly do not think that Superman applies an abundance of thought to everything he does. They think that he's just, well, killing bad and must move on. But no, it's not like that. He's someone who has seen so many different things. He's seen things that honestly, a lot of people can't even comprehend. In my mind, he has seen things that he cannot really explain to readers in a comic book story because it's too complex and too infinitesimal. He has such a wide perception, but you've seen in other stories like All-Star, certainly, and the Busick stories that we've talked about before, that his moral outlook is really informed by his ability to perceive more of the physical world around him and to really see the essence of the living beings around him too. And like, how would we all act if we were able to see the impact that we could have on people's essences? Would we choose to be better people ourselves in our day-to-day lives if we could see and perceive on the level that Superman can? And I would like to think that we would, and that's one of the things, like, it's not just a philosophical outlook with him, but there's a degree of physical outlook for him too that I don't think enters into the conversation as much. And that's why when Superman does take the time to teach these things, the best Superman writers always approach it from coming from a place not of lecturing someone about the value of life, but in just trying to bring more people aboard. He's never talking down to people. Superman generally doesn't talk down to people unless they've done something horribly wrong, you know. He believes inherently in the value of every individual, but he also understands that regular people are limited by their perceptions of the world in a way that he is not limited by. And this story doesn't necessarily play with that as much, but I do think that understanding that gives a little bit more weight to where he comes from and why he has taken such time to arrive at his ultimate moral conclusions that are at least tangentially informed in this story. So, I mean, maybe it's not a lot of words just there. I know. These things tend to rattle around in my head rather uninterrupted and through the stream of my consciousness, but it's one of the things that always galls me is that people always think Superman is lecturing, and it's not that. You know, he's not really he doesn't try to lecture just for the sake of lecturing. He's trying to save everybody's soul around him if he can. And it's one of the things that makes him a hero.
This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show too. Thank you. My love of the TV series Smallville is well documented, and there's one Smallville podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring great insight, passion, and humor to each and every episode, and the podcast will continue with more great Smallville and Superman talk even after their series coverage concludes. Listen wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On To banner, including Arrow, Star Wars, and more. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations, Harrison, New York, Muncie, Indiana, or Skokie, Illinois, home to our pal, Sweet Sweet Bernie. If you have children and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow them on social media. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate your thoughts on all of this. And the other thing in this scene with Pa, this introduces this idea or this question about whether or not Superman actually will be able to take down the elite if he needs to. So Pa brings up this question. Clark doesn't answer it. And then I'm jumping ahead a bit, but when we get to that scene the night before of Lois and Clark in bed talking about this, and I have a lot more to say about that, but she says, I think they can beat you. And he doesn't say, no, I got this. However, well, actually, let me ask you this question. Throughout the story, do you think Clark is unsure about whether or not he can actually take them down? The story, right, is raising the question for the reader, but do you think Clark himself is actually unsure throughout?
I think it makes sense that he is, just because of the power level that they represent. And early on in the story, he hasn't had as much time to really dig into who they are and what they're about. And considering what we saw with the gorilla, I think he's naturally pretty put off by the level of power that they all have. But when we get closer to the end, like maybe around the time he is talking with Lois, by that point, I'm not sure. I could see it going either way. You know, I could see that he is legitimately unsure about whether or not he would be able to prevail in a physical confrontation. But I can also see, like, I got to keep this to myself. I know what the end game is here. And I know what I'm going to have to do to actually illustrate for people why this is so messed up. And I'm going to play this really close to the chest until the moment comes.
Yeah, that's the thing. But I think there's room for interpretation here, which is great. I like that. But yeah, he's seen what they're capable of. And definitely that blast from Coldcast did do a number on him. He was disoriented when he was in Japan. Hat is able to conjure all of these magical creatures, and Menagerie has these, I don't know, what are they? Alien-esque creatures
Yeah,
that she can
I,
control.
I, I think so.
And then Manchester Black himself, of course, telekinetic, telepathic abilities. But I don't know. My read on this is I don't think Clark's worry in this is that he can't physically stop them. I really think it's he doesn't want to have to. Maybe he's not sure exactly how far he's going to have to go to do this. But even just beyond that, I think it's just not wanting to have to teach them the lesson that way, the way he ultimately does. I don't know. Like, I really feel like that's my read on this from him. I don't get the sense that he's like, I don't know if I can. It's like, what am I going to have to do? What am I going to have to become in order to do this? That's always been my kind of read on it.
I think that's a good read, especially considering that even in that scene, he chooses not to respond when she says, "I think they can beat you." But he's also so off put by those playing children
Yeah.
that it crystallizes for him in that conversation, the need for a dramatic example. And his lack of response to Lois making that kind of assertion or conclusion is very telling. And I feel like it does hint at his understanding of a need for a dramatic example, maybe even for her, that there's another way, and that, yeah, he is willing to die for people. He's willing to die for those principles. But does he really think it's going to come to that? In my mind, no, I don't think so. But I think he is still unnerved at why such a dramatic example is required.
Yes.
Maybe because there was sort of a hint of that too in President Lex. It's not necessarily that he was he just didn't seem to think that anybody saw Lex Luthor outside of the way that he saw Lex Luthor. So it was a rude awakening when he is swept in to become the most powerful person, politically speaking, on the planet. And here, the depth of, I guess, devotion that people have to the elite's ideas, I think is legitimately unnerving for him. Not to the point where it breaks his philosophy, but to the point where he understands, like, okay, I'm an immensely powerful being. These are the beliefs that I have that I know are going to get us to that better world that I want for everyone. The fact that I have to go this far to demonstrate my devotion to that is deeply unsettling to me, but that's not going to stop me from doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. That is how I view it. And I believe it's right after the conversation with Pa that we get that montage of people in Metropolis and he's hearing everything that they're saying. And there's a lot of endorsement of the elite and their methods. And the one that really sticks out, I think, to the readers and certainly to Clark is the kids playing. And you've got the kids dressed up as members of the elite and another one dressed up as Superman who's upset he doesn't want to be Superman, right? Because the other ones get to kill and he doesn't. And he's upset by this. And Superman will reference that later when he's talking to Lois, and he'll say, I heard kids and they thought it would be fun to kill, right? Fun to kill. Like it so stands out to him, understandably so. So that montage, we'd gotten all the, like I said, those kind of sound bites throughout the issue, but that montage in particular, as Superman is flying through the city and seeing how people are swept up in all of this, it really went a long way. You feel for the character, you feel the frustration for everything he's done for them, and how quickly they can be led astray by those who claim to have the answers, right? To have these quick fixes that are not thought through. And by the end of the story, the people will come to their senses and have a bit of that buyer's remorse, which, again, parallels to what we're living through. But you feel for him.
And Pa basically tells him that's what's necessary, like the lesson that's when he starts to concoct what the lesson is going to look like. And I mean, Bruce Wayne said it via David Goyer. People need dramatic examples to shake them out of apathy. And it's not necessarily apathy that's the problem. It's arguably a sense of too much investment in these ideas that run counter to a kinder society that Superman wants for everybody. But still, Superman's worldview is one that does not shy away from the fact that there is brutality and inequality in the world. He says as much in this story, and he said as much in a bunch of different definitive stories of the modern era. But there is something about the way that it's just sort of framed here that I think really does make it not a particularly underrated in my mind, because these kinds of moral discussions are kind of they're very important to have in superhero storytelling in order to reinforce for readers and even just casual observers that yes, there's an element of fantasy in these stories. Naturally, of course there is. I mean, as much as he's called the most realistic superhero, Batman is a fantasy. Let's not shy away from that. It's a fantasy in more realistic terms or in more recognizable visual language, but still a fantasy. But with Superman, the fantastical elements do not belie the fact that what he is fighting for in these stories are very real. And this is a story that I think is a really good example of him trying to fight for something that we recognize through the medium and the prism of comic book storytelling. And the best writers tell us stories about ourselves, and I think that's what Joe Kelly's doing here.
Yeah, I mean, really consistently under Joe Kelly's pen, Superman is a hero of an aspirational hero of high-minded ideals. And this is very much a battle for the soul of the people that he's waging. It's really this philosophical conflict. That's why ultimately, I really do feel like the physical question of whether or not he can overcome them is secondary. It goes so much more beyond that. At this point, we have the third and final action by the elite or altercation before the big climax. And it's this moment where Superman takes down these aliens and J and K from Men in Black, right? They look exactly like them. A bit of an homage, I suppose. But he's able to subdue this situation without any loss of life, which he points out to the elite as they arrive. And then Manchester starts to direct Hat to take out these people, because there's this whole backstory about how quote unquote J and K and the Men in Black traffic in these aliens and sell them away. So the whole thing. And Superman doesn't want to let this happen. And he decks Hat. And that's that last little justification that I suppose Manchester was looking for, where it's like, you put hands on one of us, we're going to settle this, and essentially challenges him to a showdown. Now, this is, I think, the one area for me where I really felt like the animated movie has won over on the comic book story, because the equivalent in the animated movie is Superman once again fighting the Atomic Skull, who had been apprehended earlier and then got out. He escaped, and he once again subdues Atomic Skull in the streets of Metropolis. And then you have the elite show up, and the people are there, and the people are calling for Atomic Skull to be executed. And Superman is unable to stop Manchester Black. Manchester Black literally, disintegrates or obliterates Atomic Skull's skull and kills him. And the people are on board with that. And then I think it's actually Manchester he hits, but it's the same sort of effect of like, okay, now we have to settle this. But I just like that because it brought the people in an even more tangible way. Maybe you could argue it's too on the nose. I don't know. But I liked that. I liked putting Superman in that moment, in that scene on the street, surrounded by these people who are calling for this, even though the situation has been handled. So that's one instance where I really did like the way it played out in the movie. I thought it just kind of conveyed the point a bit in a stronger way.
I agree. I mean, bringing people or involving more people in the conundrum, I guess, or in the larger debate is arguably pretty important, because you're talking about these two characters in Manchester Black and Superman that basically act as proxies for this wider social conversation to take place. And like we see enough of the people, I guess, in the original issue to get the point across, but emphasis is welcome.
Yeah, I just felt like that scene took it out of the realm of hearing or seeing clips on the news or even Superman flying through and hearing these conversations and just really brought it to the forefront. And then even when we get to the final fight, I thought the movie did a better job there too of getting those reaction shots from the crowd. I felt like that really went a long way. Like I said, to really show the journey that the people go through in all of this. But after this challenge, we're going to have this final confrontation. We get this beautiful scene between Lois and Clark. And this to me, as you might know, Chris, I don't know if you and I have talked about this specifically, but I love the Rocky movies endlessly. And this reminded me so much of the scene from the first Rocky movie where Rocky and Adrian are talking, having this heart to heart before the big fight with Apollo. And Rocky's sitting there on the bed and then will eventually lie down. And it's the, not to turn this into a Rocky podcast, but it was a scene, like they didn't want to shoot it. They were running short on time and over budget and whatnot. And Stallone insisted, he's like, you gotta get this scene. And I'm so glad he fought for it because it's this critical scene where he redefines what victory means. He's like, I can't, I could do my Stallone, but he's like, I can't beat Apollo. And I love Adrian in that moment too. She always has his back. She's like, all right, what are we going to do? She's with him either way. But then he has this whole bit about how I can't beat him, but I can go the distance. No one's ever gone the distance with Creed before. If I'm standing when that bell rings, I'll have done something no one else has done. I'm going to tear up now. And I'm going to prove I wasn't just some bum from the neighborhood. So he redefines what victory means. And this back and forth between them, to me, was very reminiscent of that. And why this question of whether or not he can beat them really doesn't even matter, because he's got to teach them this lesson. That's what his objective is in this. But I love the way all of this plays out, where Lois says, and she says she's asking this as his wife, as Mrs. Clark Kent, not as a reporter or anything else, but she's like, can't you call the Justice League or the New Gods or someone? Why does this have to be you? Why does this have to be your fight? And he's like, they brought this fight to me. And she's like, you went after them. And he's like, they're perverting everything I fought for. They're killing people and laughing. And then we have this moment where she says, I don't think you can beat them. And he relays what he had observed about those children playing, about how he heard these kids saying it'd be fun to kill. And he's like, people have to know there's another way. People have to know someone believes in humanity enough. And she cuts him off. She's like, to die for them? And they just hold each other quiet. But it's, oh my God, I basically just recounted the scene. But what observations or anything stands out to you that you want to share?
No, it's beautiful. I honestly had not really given a lot of thought to the comparison to Rocky, but I totally see it now that you mention it. But the fear, I guess, between both of them in this conversation is very palpable, but it comes from very different places. We can debate whether or not he is actually concerned for his own mortal well-being. But at the end of the day, that's secondary to what the ultimate objective is out of this, because even if he can beat them very easily, that doesn't necessarily mean that the objective is going to be accomplished in the way that he wants to accomplish it. And Lois, I think, just is of the mind that a symbolic victory is not necessarily worthy of threatening your physical well-being to the level that I think these people threaten it. But Superman is very focused on the mission. He's very focused on the necessity for showing people why the way that the elite generally goes about things is just not right. It might be effective for what they want to do, but is that the kind of world that we want to live in, where the elite are the ones who get to define what heroism looks like? And I think that's really, at the end of the day, what this whole issue comes down to, is this debate between, well, do you want heroism to look like the elite's brand, where it's bloody and vindictive and ruthless? Or do you want it to come from Superman's brand, where he's someone who understands that when you kill a person now, you not only kill everything they are, but everything they could ever be? And why should we lean into our worst instincts, even if it's more difficult to lean into our better instincts if it means that we all live in a better, more prosperous society going forward. Because those are the stakes at the end of the day, how we put symbols on pedestals is because of the impact that they have on the world that we live in. And if I were living in this world, if I was a citizen of the DC universe, then I sure as hell would want Superman to have a one up, because I think a world that understands the necessity for decency is more important than extracting a pound of flesh just because you can.
100%, right? Like the elite, they're espousing this quick, easy fix that might be viscerally satisfying in the moment to see justice meted out, especially when especially in the realm of the comic book world, the seeming revolving door, right, where villains come through. But and to your earlier point, I think Superman's worldview is so developed, and he's able to take that longer view and think it through. And in the movie, when he says to the United Nations, like, I'm not a judge and jury, and I'm definitely not an executioner. I mean, there are philosophical reasons why he wouldn't do this. There are practical reasons too. Like, there's a reason why there are processes in place. But on the philosophical side, when you said, if you kill someone, you kill all they'll ever be, that calls to mind a great moment from the Philip Kennedy Johnson Action Comics run, which might have been what you were thinking of when you said that. But when he's having that conversation, I believe it's with Metallo. And I think Metallo says, like, why didn't you kill me? Or something to that effect. And he's like, well, if I kill you now, this is all you'll ever be. Right? I might be conflating some of these moments from the comic, but I remember that really standing out. And it because it's one of those things to say, oh yeah, Superman doesn't kill. But why? And so I feel like when you get an articulation of that worldview, it does carry a lot of weight.
Yeah, and I mean, you could argue too that in terms of the predominant Superman stories of the time, that this might be outside the lane a little bit, so to speak. We've actually seen over on Marvel, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years, there's been this broader conversation about like the symbolism of the Punisher and what that means in broader society, and the comics decided to directly address that too, and try to define for people what that symbol actually is. But I mean, putting a definition on a symbol is a notoriously difficult thing to do that often takes decades to actually establish. And one of the things that I really do like about this issue is that Superman understands the symbolic power that he has, not just because of the symbol that he wears, but because of what he has stood for over the course of his career. And the elite clearly demonstrate that they don't think he stands for much. But so many villains make this mistake by oversimplifying Superman's philosophy because they don't think that it is earned. And hopefully at the end of this, and certainly at the end of Ending Battle, Manchester Black is going to get a rude awakening about how well built Superman's philosophy actually is, because he thinks it's built on a flimsy cardboard foundation when instead it's built from cosmic materials that are 30 times harder than anything on our periodic table. So
yeah, I mean, ultimately, it really seems like he doesn't believe Superman understands the reality of the world or can deal with the reality of the world. And that's not the case. It's funny because we're talking about this and we're doing this episode in the context of our Loeb Kelly era run of episodes. And I talked about President Lex and kind of my feelings towards that. And it's interesting. They don't beat you over the head with this here. But if you do look at this issue in the context of what's going on, it's like you have to imagine that Superman's frustration with the people. I mean, I don't know that I don't know that he would even characterize it as frustration. My frustration on his behalf is compounded by the fact that this is right on the heels of the people electing Lex, and they go right from that. And is there a connection there? Maybe that's a bit of a. But it's like the story doesn't go there, but there is that backdrop too. That's really interesting. It's like right after this huge betrayal where they elected the greatest villain of the DC universe to its highest office. That now the people are throwing their lot behind these lethal enforcers. So it's just really interesting. But so we get to this final confrontation, and Superman pleads to not do it in the streets of Metropolis. So Manchester grants him this last request, and they go off into space. And initially, it seems like the elite make short work out of Superman. Manchester gives him the equivalent of a stroke by using his telekinesis to crush the capillaries in his brain, even though they're as tough as steel, I think was what he says, something to that effect. Cold cast blasts him, and he's seemingly vaporized, and all that's left is a shred of his cape, right? But then we get, I think, one of the most satisfying payoffs, I think, to any Superman story, where first it's just the voice. He's like, thank you. You showed me my mistake. My mistake was treating you people as if you were people. And by the way, we haven't mentioned him yet, but one of the absolute highlights to me of the animated movie is hearing George Newbern, who I really enjoyed on Justice League Unlimited, deliver these lines, and especially this moment where you don't see Superman, you just hear the disembodied voice. Hearing the performance and just the sound design, like it's like this booming voice that just comes out of nowhere. It gives it an increased effect. So I really like that. But then he just systematically takes them apart. He poisons Menagerie, creates a vacuum that sucks the air out of the Hat's lungs, tosses Cold Cast into orbit. He seemingly kills all of them, and then reveals himself to Manchester with that line that I started this with. How does it feel to have your flaws exploited, to watch your dreams die, to be deconstructed? And I love this bit here where he seemingly gives Manchester Black a lobotomy by way of heat vision. And by the way, when he reveals himself, he looks deranged, right? His bloodshot eyes and his hair's like singed off. And he looks so unhinged. But yeah, he claims that he's used his X-ray vision, focused through Manchester's retinas, to slice off the part of his brain that's given him these metahuman abilities. Instant lobotomy, as he calls it. And Manchester starts to cry. It's such an amazing moment and an amazing turn. Do you want to take it from here, or anything leading up to this, or from this point forward?
I think that it does a good job of illustrating, like, Manchester Black. Here's the thing. There's been a lot of history added to him in the intervening 30 years or 24 years, and give or take, close to 30 years. But here, his first appearance, I think he's very much designed largely strictly as a foil, right? So what I feel is going on here is that Kelly is critiquing how flimsy this kind of outlook on heroism really is. Because as soon as Manchester's core advantage is taken away, he folds like a wet blanket. And I think it does a lot to illustrate just how flimsy his own worldview is, that is built on what he thinks is this realistic tendency toward brutality, when that's just not the case at all. And I like that the moment is constructed in such a way to give that kind of service to the larger debate that we've been going on for 30 some odd pages by this point. But as the conflict continues and Superman does reveal exactly what's going on, I feel like the purpose of the tears might change a little bit, because they're not gone by the time he says the pivotal line that sets up the conclusion of the story. They're still streaming down his face, because it is such an utter defeat on so many different levels that Superman has engineered for him. You know, it's not just a physical defeat, but the philosophical defeat, I think, does sting a lot harder in conjunction with everything else that we've seen. And that's what proves the necessity for what Superman was talking to Lois about. It needed to be such a dramatic example, but it probably worked out better than he dreamed it would too, because it is such a holistic defeat of one guy. This is arguably the most merciless victory that Superman has ever extracted from a single foe. And that's one of the reasons I also like it as much as I do, because like this was the necessary outcome in the battle for at least Metropolis's soul, if not the world's soul. This was what needed to happen in order for that example to have the intended effect. And other stories go into it, and we might briefly talk about those, but the victory for Superman here, it's not something that he's like pounding his chest about either. He doesn't like that this is a fight that had to happen on multiple levels. It doesn't mean he's going to shy away from it and and hit him as hard in so many different areas as he felt he needed to. So I really love the way this issue ends.
Yeah, it's so satisfying. But to your point, no, that's exactly it. Because if Superman had taken out the elite the way it seems he took them out, lethally, mercilessly, yes, they're quote unquote defeated, but Manchester Black's point would stand that that was the only way to prevail, to win, right? But then you have, so there's a couple of turns here, because first it seems like Superman's down for the count. Then he seemingly takes them out, but in a way you typically would not associate with Superman. And then this exchange continues. And Manchester, this is still the hope that he can hold on to. And maybe his tears would have dried up if it had gone a different way here. But it's like, they saw you. They saw what you did. And Superman's like, yeah. And I bet it frightened them. It frightened me too. And he talks about how easy it was. Like he thought it would be hard to give into this, but it wasn't. It was easy. And he says, let's see, because I pulled it up here. He says, you know what? Anger is easy. Hate is easy. Vengeance and spite are easy. Lucky for you and for me, I don't like my heroes, ugly and mean. Just don't believe in it. And then you get this reveal. He's like, yeah, they're nursing headaches I don't even want to think about, but they're all alive. And I only gave you the equivalent of a concussion, not an actual lobotomy. So he was able to achieve all of this without resorting to the elite's methods. Yet in the course of this, he made it seem as if he was. And I think that ugliness really does resonate with me, and more so in the movie. Like when you watch the animated movie, I feel like it definitely registers with the public to see Superman seemingly killed. I think there's a moment there of like, oh no, like what have we, what have we participated in? But then to see Superman seemingly give in to that ugliness, it's one of those things where it's like, is this really what you people want? Is this really what you want? And then to have that reveal, I think it's such a relief for all of us versus the audience, but for the audience in the comic, it's so satisfying. And he, that was the lesson that he had to teach, and he showed that there was another way, and he showed it, right?
Yeah, the only way that he really could, and the understatedness of the final words that are spoken here, in my mind, there's a little bit of an incongruity with the way that they're portrayed in the movie, because I feel like in the movie they are maybe a little too delivered a little too much like a pronouncement, whereas when I read this story originally, there is just kind of this understated quality where Superman has made the point. The words are just kind of the final nudge to get over the finish line. And that's something that I do really appreciate about the reading experience, because it's just like, he doesn't need to lecture at this point. His words have spoken far more, but there is still this really satisfying component that gives service to Superman's overarching philosophy when he talks about until his dream of a world where dignity, honor, and justice becomes the reality we all share, I will never stop fighting. Never. And that's just good Superman, There's there's some deviations along the way, but they're necessary deviations considering the weight that the creative team applied to the story. And it's not as necessary to revisit this kind of tenor of storytelling now, just because it might seem like a rehash of this at the end of the day. But the moral victory that he's able to extract here without actually going as hard as he could in the depictions of the defeats of the elite. Like that's one of the things that I think makes this more satisfying than it otherwise might be, is he understands the value of a symbolic victory, even though generally speaking, despite what he wears on a regular basis, Superman's not a particularly flashy person. But overall, he also understands the necessity for making a point when one is needed. probably better than anybody.
Yeah.
And the Action 775 is that incarnate. And I've always appreciated that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like he doesn't refrain from using those methods because he is incapable or scared or and like this shows
Yeah.
it's like no, I can do this, but it takes more strength not to. It takes more strength and ingenuity to find another way to solve these problems than going this route. And yeah, what tees up that quote that you laid out, Manchester's essentially saying like this isn't over. Like if you think this is over, you live in a dream world. And he says, I wouldn't have it any other way. Dreams save us. Dreams lift us up and transform us. And then the rest of the line that you had quoted. And then we end on the title of the story, which comes at the very end. What's so funny about truth, justice, and the American way? We all love the big budget superhero films, but the world of independent cinema remains a place of unbridled creative freedom and entrepreneurial spirit. Whether you're an independent filmmaker yourself or you just love movies, don't miss these New Jersey film festivals. Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, and Round Reel in Bloomfield. Submission information for filmmakers can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and much more. Fat Moose Comics, established in 1982, is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Led by current owner Sean Hendricks, Moose has that rare, old-school comic shop feel and camaraderie, yet also remains a welcoming space for new fans. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you are in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. Shall we segue to ending battle?
Please.
All right. So Manchester Black will make other appearances along the way, including in our Worlds at War, which we're getting to. But there's this 8-part storyline. It was collected back in the day and then recollected a few years ago. I still feel that like this is one that's kind of under the radar for a lot of people and often overlooked. But an 8-part storyline, it ran across 2 months of the 4 Superman titles. Just for some context for people, we have our Worlds at War, which we're going to be talking about. Using the Superman title as our frame of reference, Jeff Loeb and Ed McGuinness, they wrap up their run with issue 183, and then issues 186 and 187 of Superman are part of Ending Battle. So we're past the point where Loeb has just left the book, but Joe Kelly is still on Action Comics, Joe Casey is still on Adventures of Superman, Mark Schultz is still writing Man of Steel, which is winding down. That series won't last too much longer. And we have Jeff Johns writing the Superman issues here. And boy, that trade paperback really wants you to know Jeff Johns worked on this. Boy, does that name tower over all of the other ones. I have some feelings about that, but from a marketing perspective, I suppose I get it. And in any event, this was a late 2002 8-part storyline, again, called Ending Battle. And the setup for this is that all of a sudden, all of these B, C, and D list villains start attacking friends, loved ones, and acquaintances of Clark Kent. So yes, we do have the Kent farm attacked by the Atomic Skull. There's Atomic Skull again. His head is still intact in the comic book. He only got it blown up in the movie. So we have that. We have an attack on the Daily Planet and Lois Lane is targeted. But I think more interestingly, and I think what sets this story apart from other similar types of stories is this notion of them going after Clark's acquaintances. So they go after his high school football coach, his librarian, his accountant, his dentist. And that carries the action for a lot of this. I think there's a really key turning point at the midway point, the Action Comics issue, part 4, where Superman suspects that Lex is actually behind this. And they have a really fascinating conversation. And then it all builds to a final climax confrontation with Manchester Black. And I think we'll probably have the most to say about that. But as far as this setup about them going after his acquaintances, it's funny because when we've talked about this before, when we went through the Joe Kelly run and whatnot, I think I always felt like it was a little bit much and a little silly, but my perspective has shifted as I get older, I guess. And I knew we were going to be talking about this story, and I was really thinking about this recently. It's like these relationships that we all have with these professionals who we have very limited but essential interactions with throughout the year. They're part of kind of keeping your life running, whatever it might be. Like I think about my doctor, my primary care physician. I see this guy for 30 minutes a year, It's like, how are you? Good. I had a kid. How are you? Oh, good. We got married. It's like, but there are these very specific moments, but they play a part in our life. Like the woman who cuts my hair, she's been cutting my hair since I was a little kid. I see her every couple of months. We have a great conversation. Like it's a very specific type of relationship, but these are the supporting players in our world. So I've come around on this. I actually like the hook of this. How about yourself?
I'm okay with it. It didn't really bother me. I think it did kind of strike me as a little bit hokey the first time I read this. Revisiting it this time, just kind of accepted it. Like this is how they're going to depict this potential deconstruction of his life, and I was able to go along for the ride without really thinking about it all that much. But the first time I read it, I remember being like, "Well, geez, are they going to go after his oncologist next, or his dental specialist that he had to be referred?" I'm honestly surprised that Superman even has a dentist, to be honest with you. But
Well, apparently he goes for cleanings.
oh,
That's
okay.
because I think when he saves the dentist, he says something like, "Next time Lois Lane and Clark Kent are in for their cleaning." So, which is, what it's like. Okay, actually, that does track. I guess that he could have that procedure performed, even with his
I
abilities.
suppose, yeah. I mean, although I guess, I mean, it wouldn't be too much for me to believe that he could just look in the mirror and blast his mouth with heat vision to clean him, but
Yes,
or fly into a solar flare with his mouth open if he really wanted to. But
true.
you
There's
know,
that.
it's just like it's funny to me to think of like a dentist trying to get it's something that might be stuck between his teeth, and then like the pick or whatever it is breaks, and it's like, oh, how did this happen? I don't know. Oh.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say too, would this have tracked a little bit better or resonated more if we had ever seen any of these people before or after? Yeah, probably, probably. But I don't know. Like I said, I've kind of made my peace with it. I like the setup of it. And I mean, villain wise, like I said, we have Atomic Skull, there's Master Jailer, Fire Fist. I mean, it's not your top tier villains. As we get closer towards the end of the story, then you have Mongol and Bizarro #1 and I think Silver Banshee and whatnot. So
Yeah.
they ramp it up a bit, but that's the essential setup. And you have Superman gathering all of his friends, loved ones, acquaintances at Steelworks, right? And there's this whole kind of, I mean, quasi cover story. I mean, it is true though. It's this idea that Clark Kent is being targeted, and we need all of you here. And I have to. Where's Clark? Oh, I have to go help him, but you stay here at Steelworks. Like I said, the fourth chapter of this, where Superman confronts Lex. So there was a small period of time. I know you probably remember this, audience maybe not, but there's such a short window during this period of the Superman books where Lex knew that Clark was Superman. It happened in Superman 178 by Loeb and McGinnis. It's the Uncle Sam issue. It was an issue where the character Uncle Sam was disillusioned and was fighting Superman, and they talked it out and whatnot. But at the conclusion of that, there's this like lowly clerk who brings Lex these files that show Clark's spaceship crash landing on the Kent farm. It's like all these satellite photos and whatnot. And it ends with him saying Clark Kent is Superman. And you're like, oh my God, like he knows and he's the president. Like what's going to happen? Nothing really happens. And by the end of Ending Battle, Manchester Black has erased this knowledge from Lex's mind. So it was such a short period of time. But dude, this scene that we get between Superman and Lex, because Lex, as the president, he's gone AWOL, he's gone off the grid to his secret island hideaway. And Superman finds him because, again, he figures who would have the means and the motivation to do, like, if someone found out that I'm actually Clark Kent, like, who would do this? Lex. And so he tracks Lex down. And I love this where Lex is like, I know you don't have trackers on me. And I know my teleporters can't be traced. You memorized my heartbeat, didn't you? Which I love. Like, that's how he found him. And the reason why I love this, and I've talked about this before, this is the dynamic between Superman and Lex, where Lex knows the secret, but there's this, they can have a conversation. There's enough civility there that they can have a conversation. It's like what we got for that one scene in the Smallville series finale. Like that to me is the sweet spot of what I like in my Superman Lex dynamic. I love this moment.
Well, and who knows each other better than the other here? I mean, I think Johns did effectively play with parts of this dynamic by the time he got to his Justice League run when Lex was actually a part of the team, but the pretense of the identity wasn't as much of a fixture there, of course. But no, I really liked this issue too, and that moment in particular, because there is a sense of of a near miss of ships in the night when it comes to their relationship with each other in certain elements and in certain ways that it's depicted. And this era was really good at sort of illustrating the complementary dynamics that each of them have in their relationship with each other, even if it's not a friendship. If it were, it would be a very good one. But that's not the tact that it takes here. It's like it betrays that Lex does have a level of respect for him. It's not like early on in President Lex when he was facing off against Batman. It's
Right.
like Luthor has like no respect for Batman whatsoever. But with Superman, it's different. And I mean, by necessity, of course, but it leads to some really fascinating character interactions here that you just can't replicate with any other two characters. And for me, that's the sweet spot. Is just like there's a conversation that Superman and Lex Luthor can have with each other that you just cannot get from anybody else. And this is one of those instances.
Yeah, 100%. It's great. I mean, the bit about him memorizing the heartbeat, and then Superman says, he's like, "Do you know?" And Lex is like, "I want to hear you say it." He's like, "Do you know who I am?" "Yes, Clark. I know." Yes, I know. And there's this whole bit where Lex goes through the three people that Lex loves. He's like, myself first and foremost, of course. Second, Lena, despite what you might think, because of course he had traded Lena to Brainiac 13, which we talked about. And then he shows off a statue of Lois. And his desire to not want to see her hurt is perhaps the one thing that's saving Superman. And there's also a really interesting moment where Lex is like, I have a sense that a change is coming that's going to undo. He knew Infinite Crisis was coming. It's very intuitive, that Lex Luthor, but yeah, I like, you know what it was though? I mean, as maybe a little silly as it was, but the fact that there was an awareness on his part that then is conveyed to the reader and proves true by the end of the story when Manchester Black, even before any Crisis shenanigans, but just this notion of like, we're recognizing that this is a small window. We're not going to get another moment like this again. It was very satisfying.
Absolutely. No, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, I've talked with you before, I think about, when I'm given a reason to root for Lex Luthor, I really go all in,
Yep.
In instances we talked about a New Krypton, of course, but there have been several other ones. But Lex being a member of the Justice League is one that comes to mind for me, despite, well, I know that you generally have a softer perspective on the New 52 nowadays,
Yeah.
but, in the moment, I was actually quite into what Justice League was doing on a monthly basis. So I actually really enjoyed the dynamic of Lex being a member of the team. And here, it's still an antagonistic bent to everything, understandably so. But any time that they can even get on a modicum of the same page, or at least like in the same general area when it comes to something that's in front of them, yeah, you in the hands of a good writer, which I classify Joe Kelly as, this is a dynamic that is just irreplicable anywhere else. And I think that he's a creator who understands that, well, when I've got this dynamic to play with, I'm going to play the hell out of it.
Yeah. I love that members of the elite, I guess the other three, show up and they realize that they see Superman and they like run away.
Yeah.
Just a couple of them.
They don't want to repeat. They don't want to repeat, it's they've been down that road before.
Yeah. And then I guess it's that issue where Superman comes upon Cyborg Superman, who's taken over Bunny, the ship, and they have their altercation. But Superman comes away from that issue, the halfway point in the arc, knowing that Manchester Black is the one behind this. I'll be perfectly honest. I feel like this arc could have been 4 issues or 5. I don't know that it needed 8. Because we really kind of continue to hit a lot of the same beats about these D-list villains attacking his acquaintances and whatnot. I want to make sure that we spend the time, I think, where it's most deserved, which is in the climax, the final issue of the story, where Superman finally tracks down Manchester Black at the Lane Kent apartment and seemingly finds Lois dead. It appears that Manchester Black has killed Lois. She was with everyone else in the Steelworks, but she had to go get in on the action, and so she left and she went to the apartment, and Manchester Black was there. And so Superman shows up and seemingly finds her dead body. How did this play for you? This whole final issue, this final confrontation between the two of them.
Well, I because I came into this run generally speaking so late, I was not existentially concerned for Lois. But I was really interested to just see how it was going to play out. And then ultimately the thing that I've come away with, and we'll get into the particulars of the way that the beats end the story, but this feels like pretty essential reading if you were someone who really liked whatever happened to Truth, Justice in the Amer or what's so funny about Truth, Justice in the American Way. Confusing.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but one of the things that I just really feel like a new reader might come away with is a sneaking suspicion going into this moment before seeing how it concludes that we are about to get Superman going crazy because there have been so many other media adaptations that have hinged on the idea that this is the thing that will push him over the edge. Um, we'll talk about that, I'm sure, but obviously things go a little bit differently. And I'll just leave it at saying that it's one of the reasons I really appreciate this. But I wholeheartedly agree with you. I honestly feel like this could have been 2 issues tops, considering that how much of the meat, the narrative meat, is backloaded into the conclusion. We needed maybe one more issue of setup to actually get to the really truly valuable elements of this story, and it's here.
Yeah, no, 100%. It's yeah, fewer issues I think would have served the story well. Because yeah, I mean, as far as it being backloaded in this concluding chapter, we get this double page spread of Manchester Black explaining kind of what he's been doing behind the scenes. He was the one who was responsible for Lex learning that Clark is Superman, because he had been, after he was let out during our Worlds at War and whatnot, he was tracking Superman. And I guess when Sam Lane was killed, Superman called out Lois. And then that clued Manchester in, and was able to put everything together. So yeah, we get a bit of an info dump here. But I mean, the long and short of it is that even when faced with the seeming sight of Lois Lane murdered, of course, it will turn out by the end that this was a ruse by Manchester Black and Lois was not actually dead. But even faced with the unthinkable, Superman does not break. I mean, there's a whole extended sequence where, and remind me on this, does he say to Manchester, like, because ultimately it's in Clark's mind, but I think Superman kind of like invites him in, like, tell me what I'm thinking or something to that effect. I don't know, but it's essentially he imagines unloading on Manchester Black and frying him with his heat vision. But even in that moment, even after Superman kind of games that out, he's left with the realization that he's still angry. The anger is still there. The hurt is still there. And all he's done is undo who he is and everything that he and Lois stood for. So back in the reality of that situation in the apartment, he doesn't take that step. He does, even faced with that, he still doesn't cross that line.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I just absolutely love about this story, and one of the things that I really do feel like elevates it to essential reading. I mean, I think I've alluded to the idea a little bit before, but I'm a bit of a gamer. And in 2013, one of the games I was playing a lot was Injustice: Gods Among Us. And I really love that game, and I think that the first game's story is actually very good because the spoiler alert, but the final battle that you fight is a mirror match of Superman. It's our quote unquote our Superman versus the Injustice corrupted Superman. And as far as I know, it was a story that was primarily written by Jimmy Palmiotti and Justin Gray. They also did the story for or at least the DC elements of Mortal Kombat versus DC Universe, in addition to all of the comics that they've written over the years, and understood how to adapt the characters properly. But you read Ending Battle, it makes it easy, I think, to side eye the whole impetus of the Injustice story. It makes it pretty damn easy to side eye the conception of the future in the DCEU that we glimpsed in Zack Snyder's Justice League, and to side eye a lot of these perceptions that people have that Superman is like the Joker, just one bad day away from putting all of us under his thumb. But Kelly, I think, is a writer who write, and Johns, and of course other members of the creative team too, but Kelly in particular, just considering his place in writing this, we talked before about how well built Superman's philosophy is, and it's not through a lack of trial in his own life. He's seen things, he's been through things, and Manchester, I feel, completely discounts how well built Superman's philosophy is. So when he introduces this element to try to destabilize his entire worldview again by making the stakes far more personal, and Superman still doesn't break, then I think that says volumes about maybe elements of those other stories like Injustice or maybe parts of the DCEU that take Superman's philosophy for granted a little bit. And that don't really appreciate just how sturdy it is and resistant to these pernicious forces that are always trying to unravel it. Manchester Black arguably took the biggest possible swing that someone could take at Superman's philosophy, and it bounced off like a bullet off of Superman's chest at the end of the day. It doesn't mean he doesn't feel the pain. It doesn't mean he doesn't feel the anguish. It doesn't mean he is not going to be broken in some respects. But when he says, I will not dishonor my wife for you, because she also sacrificed things in order to uphold that worldview and in order to uphold that brand of heroism that Superman represents. And that's just, I just love that issue to death. The way that Ending Battle does end. It is a wonderful reinforcement of Superman's entire philosophy and a great compliment to the Action 775 story. And it's a pretty defining moment, honestly, in my mind, about why Superman is such an exceptional hero and an exceptional character. And it's one of the things that I love.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are multiple panels where, to your point about how it's not that he doesn't feel this, right? He does. And there are multiple panels where he's just stunned. He's just like kneeling there and he's just saying no, like he can't believe it. He hears a heartbeat. He thinks it's her. Manchester claims, no, it's mine. So obviously messing with his head and whatnot, but it's like you see that he is taking all this and he's processing it. I looked it up. He does say, you're the telepath, read my mind. And then that's what kind of kicks us off on this whole sequence where he imagines giving into it, but then ultimately doesn't. I agree with you. It is a great compliment to 775. And what's funny is it's like, we read 7 issues to get to it of Ending Battle, but you really could just pull out chapter 8 and it works in and of itself because it's that final confrontation with Manchester. And it's I think a valuable escalation of the conflict that started in 775, because now we're, like you said, it's like now we're taking it into the realm of the personal. It's one thing to get at this debate of like, oh, well, why don't you kill Atomic Skull when he gets out of prison again, when he escapes? But now it's, well, what if the person you love the most is taken from you, right? Would that be enough? And Manchester's whole thing seems to be like, essentially like he lives that Superman lives in a fantasy world. Like he doesn't appreciate the reality of this. But obviously, Superman proves him wrong. And what's like fascinating is that he wins over Manchester Black. I mean, I don't, for lack of a better term, I mean, Manchester's takeaway is like, wow, like you really are the real deal. So much so that then he erases Lex's memory and blows himself up. I mean, he'll come back, but
I wonder if that is something that you could debate, though. Did he win him over, or did he always have him won over? And it's just like Manchester is so, I guess, incensed at the idea that this one person was able to instill a level of hope in him. He came to resent it. But then on the other side of this, when he proves that he is the real deal and that he is someone who believes in these things and that hope is not in vain in Manchester's own mind, it's almost like he's made a fool of just inside his own head and just doesn't know what to do with that information. I mean, that's debatable probably, but that's kind of the impression that I got, especially by the end when it's like, you did stir this in me. And I devoted myself to proving why that's a fraud and why that feeling, even that I have, is unjustified. But actually, it is.
Yeah, it's funny. When we talked about this story before, I'd have to go back and check the tape, but I feel like I not that I made an argument that he should have killed Manchester Black, but I think I probably landed on the side of like, I would have understood in that specific circumstance. But going back to what I said before, I really do draw a line between sort of an in the heat of the moment, kill or be killed sort of scenario versus executing, right? And that's what this would have been. And
Yeah.
that would have been a betrayal. And I think ultimately I always would have recognized that, but especially really taking the look that we have at this Loeb Kelly run and Kelly. And I think the way Kelly views the character, I think generally was shared by the creators at the time. But, we see this high-minded aspirational quality in so many of Kelly's stories, like the Wonder Woman 1,000 Years in Valhalla story, 775, it's such a consistent through line that he will not break. And so this was totally consistent and really did honor the character and what he stood for. But, Ending Battle, like 775 is one of those things. My goodness, if you're listening to this and you haven't read it, please go read it. It's actually, you know what? It's free on the app. You can read it for free on the DC app. You don't even have to have a paid membership. So if you haven't read it, like, please read it. It's a classic. Ending Battle, I'm kind of hard pressed to say like, oh, you got to go out there and you got to get this trade or read it. If the setup we described sounds interesting, go for it. But if nothing else, I really would say to read Chapter 8, the Action Comics issue by Kelly, because it's really a really nice compliment to 775.
Yeah, I mean, the whole story, I think it's kind of a fun tour of lesser seen Superman villains, particularly of the time. So in that respect, like it's an interesting artifact of the era, especially considering what the books were up to during this time. But yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to agree with you that certainly the last issue does warrant a look, particularly if you are going on a journey that includes what's so funny, then that the conclusion of Ending Battle absolutely makes for a satisfying follow-up. Um, we saw Manchester Black a bit more with Joe Kelly in other titles.
Yeah, he did a whole Justice League Elite maxi series, right?
Yep.
Yeah, which
Yep.
I don't honestly don't know if I've read that all the way through. I might have back in the day as it was coming out, but I don't have a strong memory of it.
I haven't read it. I would like to. I think I was planning on absorbing it more in concert with his Justice League run, because I think that would make sense, and I think they are pretty tied together. But people I trust seem to enjoy it, so I'll probably give it a look. I'm more motivated to give it a look now than I was a few weeks ago, let's say. But overall, I mean, this is just a really effective meditation on Superman's philosophy and how well built it is. And if more people read this, then I don't think I would have to do nearly as much defending as I ended up doing in the halls of my comic shop, because it does address a lot of those core criticisms of Superman pretty head on.
No, absolutely. And, we've been covering the whole Loeb Kelly run, and 775 is the only single issue that warrants a whole episode. And obviously, we did the movie and Ending Battle, but still. But I wanted to spend the time on it because it like I said, my appreciation for it has grown so much over time. To see how well it's held up, to see how timely it remains, it really is a fascinating meditation on who Superman is and what he stands for. And that whole line about how does it feel to be deconstructed? It's a fascinating line because we have so many stories that do that to Superman, that remove certain assumptions and ask questions. And so for the character himself to sort of be saying like, hey, how do you like it? I really appreciated it. But it's an all-timer, and it was a blast to revisit. And I really appreciated all of your insight on this. So I thank you for joining me. And where would you like to direct folks?
Oh, well, thank you again for the invitation. I really appreciate it. It's always good to be able to chat the world's greatest hero with you. And yeah, much obliged. Thanks again. If you're not going to do a single episode for Superman number 180, I guess I understand, but I love that issue. I don't know if that's one that you've talked about yet, where he faces off against Dracula, but it was a
Yeah, that's not going to
personal
be.
favorite.
It's not going to be its own episode.
Yeah, I understand. Personal favorite. It's just my bias is showing. I have a lot of fun. It just I remember the first time I read that, I was so delightfully surprised by the way the story went. So it's just I'll look forward to your conversation that includes that issue. As for me, feel free to check out our YouTube channel, The Comic Binge, where you can find myself and also former Digging for Kryptonite guest Javi Trujillo. We are breaking down Grant Morrison's long form Batman run issue by issue. The most recent one that we talked about was Batman number 667, which was the first issue in the Island of Mr. Mayhew that was illustrated by J.H. Williams III. And we're getting pretty close to the resurrection of Ra's al Ghul and to Batman R.I.P. and everything else that goes in there. But we had a really entertainingly disjointed conversation about Batman 663, which was The Clown at Midnight, the prose issue written by Grant Morrison. A couple of people on our panel did not like that issue very much, and we have a lot of fun breaking it down. So check out The Comic Binge if you are inclined. We could also talk about a whole bunch of other comics that are not necessarily DC related. Check out the channel, give us a look, and tell your friends if you're feeling like it. I'm also at Discovery Debrief, a Star Trek podcast. We're taking a bit of a hiatus just because there's not any Star Trek on the air right now, but we did get our very first glimpse of season 3 of Star Trek Strange New Worlds that we know is coming this summer. And that's an excellent show. And even if you're not a Star Trek fan, give it a look, because if you are a Superman fan, then you might find some things to like, particularly in Captain Christopher Pike. So check out Discovery Debrief and come along for the ride into the final frontier with us.
Awesome. I hope everyone will check that out. And now, joining me to dig into our mailbag and respond to your comments about Action Comics 775 is the host of Superhero Cinephiles and returning guest, Perry Constantine. Perry, welcome back.
Thank you for having me. I'm really glad that I'm jealous that Chris got the nod for the full discussion, but I'm happy to participate in any talk about 775.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I do believe you have cited this as your favorite Superman story.
Yeah, I mean, it's got some competition now, so I'd have to really think about it, but this would definitely be, if not the top 3, at least the top 5.
Gotcha. So shortly after we recorded that episode, which is very much, I think, a glowing celebration of the work, our friend in podcasting, Michael Bailey, put up a post on social media because he himself recently revisited 775, and he ended his post by saying, "You ever like what something says, but still have problems with the thing itself?" Now, that in and of itself, I have no objections to. I'm not calling out Michael or anything like that. And that sentiment that he expressed is something that I have similarly expressed in social media posts and episodes. Like, we wrestle with this material, right, when we do these discussions and these podcasts. So that totally tracked for me. But I guess I was somewhat surprised by the comments that followed. And it wasn't like hundreds of comments, but there were a bunch of people who kind of came forward and expressed a less than enthusiastic view of Action 775. And it was a little surprising to me because I've always kind of understood it to be a pretty generally beloved, lauded work. So I want to just share some of what I saw in the comments here. I'm not using anyone's name because this was not my post and these are not my people, but this is some of what came up. One person said, "I still don't get that issue. I find the art very off-putting and the story a bit meh." Another person said, "Without the direct context of the Ultimates, it doesn't make sense. Still problematic." Another says, "Most overrated Superman story ever." And yet another says, "Kingdom Come is a better treatment of similar themes." So it's just one of those things where I thought it would be worthwhile, since it seems like there's a bit more of a mixed reaction to this than I had typically associated with the work. I thought it would be beneficial to just kind of address some of this and share our takes. So let me toss it to you first. Anything in particular that you want to respond to?
Well, first off, everybody who says anything bad about this story is wrong, and they should seek out some professional. No. I get I get what you're saying. Like, there's definitely been stuff, and like a lot of people cite Civil War as one of their favorite stories over the Marvel side, and every time I hear that, it sets my teeth on edge because I hate that story. So I totally get, being out of step with the mainstream, a lot of that stuff, and it's, opinions are like buttholes. We all got them, and they all stink. So that's fine. Just a few things. I think these kind of surprised me too, because usually, like, this issue, it was probably when I got into the Loeb Kelly run, I think I kind of started off with Emperor Joker and I kind of dipped in here and there, but I'm pretty sure it was 775 that really kind of made me latch on. I'm like, oh, okay, this kind of, like, that issue just kind of grabbed me and just kind of like shook me and said, you have got to read this book. And so that's kind of what got me into that. That's what got me committed to that era, pretty much. That being said, I get it. People saying that without the direct context of the Ultimates, it doesn't make sense. I don't quite agree with that. I think that you can enjoy this without having that context, because I actually do have some anecdotal evidence of this, because I taught this story in a class to all Japanese students who, most of them have zero familiarity with Superman, other than they just know what he is, but they've never read a Superman story. Most of them never even watched like a Superman movie or anything like that. So, and they were able to get it pretty well. So I think the story is pretty universal. I understand why it is rooted in this era, but I think I think it does still work outside of that. The Kingdom Come argument was an interesting one to me. It's a better treatment of similar themes. And this kind of relates to another comment that we'll probably talk about later, but where someone had said that it's a little bit too direct in its treatment of the themes, whereas Kingdom Come is more subtle. And I get that. At the same time, I do think there is something to be said for, sometimes you need a delicate touch, sometimes you need to be subtle, but other times you got to hammer people over the head with things sometimes. And I think that this story does do that. I do agree that speech at the end is pretty much hanging everything right there on the door. But sometimes I don't think that's a bad thing. I think sometimes, as they said in Batman Begins, and I think maybe I heard this from your show. I think someone had said this, but when Bruce is talking to Alfred and he says that, sometimes people need dramatic examples to shake them out of apathy. I think that's true. And I think actually relating to what we're seeing now in America, that's exactly what's happening now too. So sometimes that lack of subtlety can be a good thing.
I agree wholeheartedly. And yes, Chris did quote that line, but no, I agree. I mean, on the note of the context with the Ultimates, or I guess even more specifically, the Authority, right? Because the Elite is very much a clear analog of the Authority. But I think that this work still tracks, even if you don't have that context. There is, unfortunately, I guess, a timeless quality to it. And I feel like even if you were to read this now and you had no idea about the Authority or the Ultimates, maybe you know the boys and you can kind of plug them into this. But this idea of a team, in this case, coming forward with this harsher, extreme, uber violent breed of justice, a quick, easy fix that they haven't totally thought through, and everybody kind of latching on to that at the expense of the person who's been there for them all along. I think those themes always track, even if you don't have that direct reference point. So, and by the way, as we're addressing these comments, everyone, like you said, everyone's entitled to their opinion. So it's not like I'm calling people out, but I thought it was interesting. And then I had a similar reaction to the Kingdom Come comment, because while obviously there is overlap, there too, you have this new breed of superheroes that everyone is rallying behind at the expense of our old guard. But nevertheless, I do feel like there is more than enough distinction between these two stories. Because in Kingdom Come, you have this whole bit about Superman withdrawing from society and giving in to inaction and then having to come back. But even when he comes back, he still doesn't have all of the answers. And the way that he and his allies go about things, imprisoning all of these superpowered beings, yields some pretty disastrous results. So I don't feel like it's hitting on exactly the same thing, while at the same time, of course, I can appreciate the parallels that are there. So I do feel like the stories have more distinct mandates. And then I put the call out in our Facebook group, the Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan group, and got a bunch of responses there. There were a couple of folks who mentioned the art. Spencer said, the only gripe I had with 775 was the art, not the story itself. To me, the artwork was just weird, muddled, and unrealistic, and may have benefited from having another artist, but that's just my opinion. And Lennar said, I could see someone saying it's overrated, but active dislike is surprising. Sure, the art is a little hit or miss. Both Mankey and Bermejo have gotten better over the last 24 years. And so much of the story seems to be happening off panel, but I love what this said about Superman's place at the dawn of the 21st century.
I mean, I think there's something to be said because you don't see this very often. Even back then, you didn't see it as often where you have this self-contained story in a single issue. I mean, it's almost unheard of now, but even back then it was starting to become a rarity. I mean, the Superman books, they did kind of do it from time to time, but they were also starting to lean more into the longer arcs. So I think it's a real skill that Kelly exercises here to be able to take what is a pretty big story with some pretty big themes and all this stuff happening, and he does cram it into one issue. It's a longer issue than normal, but it is still just one issue. And on the art thing, I actually really kind of like the art. I think it's got this kind of gritty feel to it that I think really lends itself well to the story's themes. Which it's funny. Spencer had also mentioned that he had preferred the art style in the animated movie, and I know you and Chris talked about this, but man, I'll just say I am not a fan of that art style in the movie.
Yes. We did have a few more critical submissions in our group, so I'll address these as well. So Jared Cardos said, I think what annoys me about it is its weird, moralistic, and shaming vibe. It seems so aghast and appalled that people like the Authority more than the books they're writing and label them as sadists. It feels like this book is labeled as a classic, not because it does anything really all that interesting, though I absolutely love the Loeb or Bermejo pages, but because it tells Superman fans what they want to hear. And I get it, I am a fan, but I don't want to see it from characters pontificating, but from action. It's what it's about after all. Now, of course, I'm a sucker for invoking our sign-off here. But and then Adam, Talking Superman on X, said, I think Joe Kelly has other stories that age better than this one, but I do still like 775. I don't even think of it so much as a criticism of heroes that kill, so much as it is a question to fans of why they want that so badly, and if they do for the right reasons. And kind of looking at these two comments together, I've announced this on social media, but this is the first opportunity that I have to share it on the show. But I have recently, as of this recording, conducted an interview with none other than Joe Kelly, and people will hear that in a few weeks. We had a wonderful conversation, and it was wide-ranging. I mean, we talked about his run overall, and he's been asked so much about 775. I had other fish to fry, but of course, we talked about it. And one of the things he talked about that I think was just kind of put the final piece into place for me, he talked about the initial inspiration for the story. Because I asked him, were there any misconceptions about this that you want to clear up? And he said, it's never been an attack on any other creators or fans or anything like that. But rather for him, he was sensing this feeling out there in the world that it was naive or childish or simplistic to adhere to the values of Superman or to believe in that kind of heroism. And that's what inspired this work. And so what Adam says here really tracks. And I think for me, the way I look at this work now more than ever is that more than anything else, I think it's making an argument for Superman, for that brand of heroism and for his place in the world, both the fictional world of the DC universe and the publishing world and our world at large. So I think it's more an argument for Superman rather than an attack on other kinds of characters or the creators who write those characters or the fans who enjoy those characters. Now, at the same time within that, and to Adam's point, I think it is kind of saying, well, all right, if you do subscribe to that kind of story or justice or whatever you want to call it, why exactly? And have you kind of considered the implications of that? And that's what I think 775 really brings to the forefront, where Superman confronts the elite and the public within the DC universe of, okay, this is what you want. I'm going to show it to you and show you how ugly it can be and see if it's still what you actually want. So that's at play. But more than anything else, I really think it's more of an argument for Superman rather than saying, because I truly don't think the point of the story is there shouldn't be a comic book like The Authority or The Ultimates or anything like that. I don't think that's the point.
No, I agree with you. And, to disagree a little bit with what Jared said, I was a fan of The Authority at the time. In fact, I was really into The Authority and The Ultimates and all that stuff before I really dove into Superman, assuming I've got the timeline straight in my head. And so even coming in this as someone who loved The Authority, who was very much drawn to that more kind of like, violent 90s anti-hero type of thing, this really did kind of cause me to start rethinking some of that. And yeah, I agree with you. I don't think it's, trying to shame anyone. I think it is just trying to say this is the best thing about Superman. And I'm going to talk about this when we talk about Our Worlds at War, but I think he shows us there is another way. There's a better way, and we have a choice. We don't have to give in to the basest instincts. And I really think and it seems like that's what I've always felt. And it seems like, that was what Joe Kelly's intention was to just show that idea that you have to try to find a better way.
Now, like I said at the top, we put the call out, and I would say the majority of the comments we got were largely positive. So I can't go so far as to say, oh, this is such a controversial work. But like I said, just a little bit more mixed than I originally thought. But here are some of the other comments that we got. Opie said, it's one of my favorites, and I think one of the definitive one-off comics of the last 20 years when it comes to both Superman and the meta commentary on the genre itself. Jan says, I'm a huge fan, personally, one of the best Superman stories of all time. I like it more than All-Star. I don't know that I could totally go that far, but I appreciate it. Man of Steven says, I love this story and really enjoyed the animated version too. Kenny says, this remains one of the best Superman stories. Terrence, my favorite Superman story of all time. Javi said, it's been a minute since I've read it, but I've been a fan since its release. I too was unaware of any hot takes or controversy. It's obviously on DC's mind as being important too, as it's getting a facsimile edition. Bruce Kanan said, I loved this story, especially being a fan of The Authority. And Mike Rhodes says, sometimes Joe Kelly's witty street dialogue banter goes over my head, but I love the quieter moments. Clark lying in bed with Lois, his conversation with Pa Kent is so good, i.e. has silenced the question, you can beat them, son, right? Is so deafening. I legitimately believe this scene is repeated in the new Superman movie that we briefly see in the first trailer, and the third act is just perfect from beginning to end. On a similar note, Chase says, when I saw the Superman vs. the Elite animated movie as a teenager, it was the first time Superman stood out from other superheroes to me in a compelling way. I love the range George Newbern shows in his voice acting throughout the movie, and the ethical battle Superman faces with the Elite and the public. Manchester Black became a favorite of mine after this, and I'd love to see him on the big screen. I could imagine James Gunn being inspired by this adaptation and the original comic, since the upcoming movie seems like it will depict a moral battle between Superman and the other superheroes like Guy Gardner. So to both Mike and Chase's points, I share that sentiment. I do feel like James Gunn's Superman will tap into this theme. While we might not have, or not, it seems like we're not going to have the Elite per se, but I think that Guy Gardner and those other heroes that we have are essentially will function similarly. So I think that theme will be at play. I get that sense as well. Do you?
I do too, especially because The Authority is one of the films that's been announced as part of this new DCU slate. So I can't help feeling that is a coincidence. I feel like, and I think there's even been mention of the Engineer appearing in Superman as well. So I feel like maybe they're going to have the Engineer in the Manchester Black role or something along those lines, which I don't know. I really dig Manchester Black, so that's kind of a disappointment. But otherwise, it does seem like they are taking some inspiration from that.
Yeah. One of the things I talk about in the conversation with Chris is I don't feel that Superman is that worried about his own fate. I think he's more preoccupied with this lesson that he needs to impart. I will say, in talking to Joe Kelly, Kelly's view is, no, he was worried about whether or not he can make it out, but we were in agreement that that's not his primary driving concern.
I always had the same reaction too, as you. Like, I always thought it was just more like he's more concerned about his, what the example people are taking from this, not so much afraid of whether or not he can. I mean, obviously that is obviously in the text, right? That's why there's that scene where Pa says, you can beat them, right, Clark? So yeah, I agree with you, but I feel it was more about that example aspect.
Yeah, for sure. I did want to address the title of the work, What's So Funny About Truth, Justice, and the American Way, and specifically recognizing the context at the time. That was the motto that DC was using. I welcome your thoughts on that as the title for this work.
I mean, first off, I do want to acknowledge the fact that, maybe the jaded leftist expat is not the best one to ask about this motto. But that being said, I'm not a fan of the American way part of the motto. And I think even Manchester Black even rightly addresses that in the issue. He says, truth, justice, and the American right-wing military industrial complex way, or something along those lines. So, and, I think the whole idea of the new tagline and all that, it's also just the kind of thing of, well, truth, justice, and the American way itself was a revision of the motto. It was originally, he fights for truth and justice. And I don't see anything wrong with that. I think that's the way to go about it, because honestly, the elite are probably acting more like the American way, especially at that time period and this time period too.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of this larger conversation about the shift in motto, yes, the two things I'll say. One is that while I recognize and appreciate the attachment that a lot of people have to truth, justice, and the American way, it's not there from the start, and it hasn't been used consistently from the start. There's a great article on Superman homepage that breaks down its usage or lack thereof throughout Superman's history, which I found really interesting. So there's that. And then I guess even beyond that, fair to say that I think people would be split on what truth and justice mean these days, or a better tomorrow. But still, truth, justice, and a better tomorrow are these, I think, more elemental ideas or ideals, whereas American way has always felt very specific and can be defined and approached differently depending on who you're asking. So for me personally, I have been on board with this change in the motto, but specifically, I guess what I want to hit on is just kind of the then existing motto, its use as the title for 775. In that context, I like it a lot because I feel like it's such a shorthand to encapsulate what we think of when it comes to Superman. And so the what's so funny about everything that I am and represent, I think is a perfect encapsulation. And I do love the way, yes, it's on the title of the cover, but you don't see it in story until the very end, the very final page, which I thought was effective.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think what's so funny about truth and justice would have worked a lot better personally. And I think I also talked about this, people can go back on Superhero Cinephiles, or we're going to be replaying the episode as part of the Summer of Superman stuff. So you can go back and listen when I talked about Superman versus the Elite. And I think I haven't listened to that episode again, but I think I went into my ideas about that title, both Superman versus the Elite and also the truth, justice, and the American way portion of it. So, but yeah, it's fine. It's fine. I mean, this is just, my jaded expat ass coming out on it.
No, fair enough. So I get what you're saying. Even at the time in 2001, even though that was the motto that was in usage, you still would have preferred if we had just stopped with truth and justice.
Yeah, I think it summarizes the themes of what's going on a lot better than adding in the American way part of it.
Okay, fair enough. Well, thank you. And thank you to all of the audience members who shared their reactions to this and gave us some fodder for discussion here. I wanted to have those voices and those perspectives included. So thank you to everyone. Thank you, Perry. I encourage everyone to check out Superhero Cinephiles. And Perry, you're going to be back here in just a couple weeks, and we're going to talk about Our Worlds at War. Can't wait for that.
Loving it.
My thanks once again to both Chris and Perry for joining me on this episode. Audience, thank you for tuning in as always. I truly appreciate it. Make sure you come back next week. Michael Bailey, who we referenced earlier in this episode, will be joining me as we discuss Return to Krypton. Big, fun episode. You don't want to miss it. Until then, as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. Support the podcast and receive exclusive content, including bonus episodes, by becoming a member at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato. Flat Squirrel Podcasts is home to Digging for Kryptonite and another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman. Please subscribe, rate, and review today, and continue the conversation by joining us on social media. Links are in the show notes. Thank you all